Hello all. Guess I can do this. I'm Terry Thornton. I'm curator of education here at the Modern, and I'd like to thank our sponsor and friends at Glass Tire for their support, and you for being here both on-site and online, for those of you who are joining us live stream. Tuesday evenings is a weekly lecture series each fall and each spring, which comes to an end for fall 2021 next week with the artist Frances Stark, who will be here in conjunction with the opening of Focus Frances Stark. So hope you will return. It's the same place, same time. Hope to see you here. Tonight, the artist Carrie Yamaoka is with us to share insights into her beautifully captivating and mysterious work. This is a Tuesday evening presentation that I have been looking forward to with great anticipation. Originally planned for the spring 2020, I first was introduced to Carrie's work by my friend and gallerist Takako Tanabe of Ulterior Gallery in New York, where I saw Carrie's solo show, Panorama, in 2019. Based in New York, Carrie has shown widely in the U.S. and Europe since the 1990s. Her work can be found in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, Centre Pompidou in Paris, and the V&A in London. Recent solo exhibitions include Recto Verso at Henry Art Gallery of the University of Washington, Dust, the Plates of the Present at Centre Pompidou, and Carrie Yamaoka, Pour, Crawl, Cast, Peel at Commonwealth and Council in Los Angeles. Her work was also featured in Arms, Ache, Avid, Eon, Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episala, Zoe Leonard, Carrie Yamaoka, Fierce Pussy Amplified at Beeler Gallery, Columbus College of Art and Design, Columbus, Ohio, and at the ICA in Philadelphia, 2018 through 2019. Also has been selected for the 8th Triennial of Photography in Hamburg this coming year, and is currently in Lesions N-KRM Mooney, B. Ingrid Olsen, Carrie Yamaoka at I-8 Gallery in Reykjavik, Iceland. Also of note, Carrie is a founding member of the queer art collective Fierce Pussy, and has been recognized with the 2017 Anonymous Was a Woman Award, as also as a 2019, I'm sorry, did I say 2019? 2017 Anonymous Was a Woman, as well as a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow, and a recipient of the FST Studio Projects Fund Grant this year, 2021. To glimpse Carrie's practice and her work before we begin, I would like to close my introduction, if you will indulge me, with the quote that was included in the announcement for tonight's Tuesday evening. So for some of you, it'll be a reminder, and others, it will be a setup for what you're about to see. Quote, "I am interested in the topography of surfaces, the tactility of the barely visible, and the chain of incidents that determine the outcome of the finished object. The viewer is placed at the intersection between the record of chemical action, reaction, and the desire to apprehend a picture, one that may emerge in fleeting and unstable states of transformation." Those of you who know me know why I'm so excited about tonight's presentation. We're all in for a very big treat. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Yamaoka.
Thank you, Terry, first of all, for inviting me here today, and thanks for all of you for showing up. I'd like to start off here with a work from 2009. It is comprised of what I used to call silver mylar, but is actually technically reflective polyester film that's mounted to wood panel, encapsulated in layers of resin. I might refer to it sometimes as reflective polyester film, and I might forget and sometimes refer to it as silver mylar, but it's really the same thing. It's 36 inches wide by 36 inches tall by 2 inches deep. Towards the top of the image area, you see a pipe running across my studio ceiling. And towards the bottom, you'll notice the camera on a tripod set on self-timer, taking the photograph. For the past 25 years, I've been making paintings using reflective polyester film as the ground. Sometimes I'm reluctant to call them paintings. Sometimes I insist they are called paintings. My practice ranges across painting, sculpture, drawing, and photography, and so I like to say I'm working in the expanded field of painting, trying to push the envelope of the medium using materials and processes I've developed through experimentation and exploration. My interest in process and the alchemy of materials has led me away from traditional painting material and toward the use of unconventional stuff. Here's another work, a little larger with a lot more incident due to all of the air bubbles and actions that happened beneath the surface when the work was mounted to the wood panel. The dark and light forms that appear are not painted in or composed, but rather what was in my studio at the time the photograph was shot. I don't paint with a brush. I try not to make pictures. There is no narrative. It is the relationship of the viewer to the object picture that I'm most interested in. I'm setting up conditions for the viewer to have the experience of engaging with the object or picture that they are complicit in the realization of, in a particular site, within a particular moment in time. The work is very challenging to photograph because of the reflective ground. Documenting the work as it presents a dilemma. Me and or my camera are always making an appearance. Therefore, the angle shots I take at times. But ultimately, the photographs will always fail to represent the experience of the work. A photograph describes only one particular stance, one particular moment. It fails to capture the flux and mutability of viewing in the round and in time. Also, the camera frames and sees differently than the viewer does. As an aside, this problem or this failure is interesting to me also, and it sparks ideas for a whole other project which I'm starting to put together, but that would be for another talk. This is a work of cast flexible resin and silver mylar, which starts on the wall and curls onto the floor. I've been working with chemical and mechanical abrasives to both erase the reflective coating of the mylar and to pick up the textures of the simplest material at hand in the studio, the wall, the floor, bubble wrap. Where I rub, the reflective coating is erased and the transparent base of the mylar film is revealed. Random variations in pressure create differing densities of imprint, arriving at imperfect tactile records. Here are two different views of the same work, derived from a rubbing of my studio wall. The first was shot in my studio in Brooklyn. The second is an install shot from Greater New York at MoMA PS1 in 2015. I use materials and processes in ways that allow a window to open between chance and intention. I employ a strategy of breaking the rules to arrive at that intersection. Beyond the additive and reductive processes usually employed in painting, I also use materials in ways to invite chance and error and defect, the lifting off of paint, the peeling, the cracking, the crawling. these two images are the same work, but taken from different angles. Oops. Okay, jumping backwards now to the late 1980s, early 90s. I'm going way back in order to draw the linkages and connections between the older work and the work I'm engaged with now. Around 1987, I began to work with text. All of my text was found, derived from typewriter correction ribbons. Back before computers, when electric typewriters were the things we used, there were two ribbons in these machines. One was the black ribbon that contained the black ink that you would type with, and the other was the correction ribbon to use as an eraser. And what the correction ribbon contained was a linear record of errors and unwanted texts that had been deleted. I collected these ribbons from friends who were writers and friends who worked in offices and museums and magazines. I transcribed the correction ribbons, and because I worked in the production department of various magazines for my day job back then, I asked my typesetter friends to typeset the sheets of transcriptions, which I then made photostats of and used as a ground in paintings and drawings. So using both deleted words and chance juxtapositions of letters that formed words for me, it was like sifting and scavenging through the garbage can to find my vocabulary. If one feels that one is situated on the margins, one might look to find oneself and one's voice there. I was using beeswax mixed with dry pigment and various tinting agents, mostly media that had a degree of translucency to it. In the early 1990s, the AIDS crisis was raging and the culture wars were being fought at local school boards and public libraries and not-for-profit arts institutions. Books that had so-called undesirable or dangerous content, frank sexuality, both hetero and homo, and radical political content were being banned from school libraries, not unlike the present moment. I chose 12 books that had either been banned from import into the US or banned from school libraries. Here was another kind of garbage can in the making, but one that held some canonical modernist works and some renegade outliers. The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, Another Country by James Baldwin, Naked Lunch by William Burroughs, Lolita, Tropic of Cancer, Catcher in the Rye, and others. I shot the photos directly from these books and worked back into the gelatin silver prints with chemical reducing agents to partially erase and edit the text for my own ends. This work is called Steal This Book No. 2 from a late 1960s or early 1970s how-to manual for activists, and it was written by Abby Hoffman. There's the doubling of reads, is it the history of slaughter, or is it an exhortation, a kind of prescription to slaughter history? From 91 to 94, off and on, I worked on a work called Archipelagos. It was a cycle of photograms, each one a unique gelatin silver print. The work was structured around an incomplete alphabet and a landscape of incarceration, names of institutions, sites, and places in the US where people have been sequestered, imprisoned, interned, perhaps even treated. Prisons, hospitals, internment camps. These places housed immigrants, people who break the law, people deemed insane, people with HIV/AIDS, Japanese Americans during World War II. I was interested in the naming of places and the contrast between the poetry of the place name, its multiple resonances, and the reality of its function. These prints were made using photographic processes, but not shot with a camera, exposed and made in the darkroom. Some of the prints are underexposed, some are overexposed, some are solarized or intentionally out of focus. In some of the prints, I've used bleaching agents to manipulate and reduce the image. Any color occurring in the prints is a byproduct of process. rather than an additive coloring agent. None of these prints would be considered proper photographic prints in the sense that they are all intentionally improperly made. So around 1994, I abandoned text in the work, I thought, completely. The AIDS crisis had a profound effect on the work I was making. It felt like words failed, and I craved a more direct mode of address with the viewer. I was experimenting with glass mirror, stripping it, using various chemicals and processes to try and disrupt the crystal clear reflection on the glass, painting and transferring different kinds of material on top of it. It soon became clear to me that glass mirror retains its hard objective appearance no matter how much I would try to mess with it. I wanted more malleability and more of a material I could manipulate, one that could easily take a mark or an impression. So I started to work with silver mylar or reflective polyester film. It has a plastic film base that is coated with a silver coating on one side. Its uses in the world might be anything from gift wrap to lining the walls of hothouses and grow houses. I even kind of liked the idea of its cheesiness and its shiny factor, the notion of perhaps incorporating and transcending that somehow simultaneously. And this is one of the first works that I made with reflective mylar, and it's from 1995. I burnished and rubbed the surface, which is what caused that swooshy appearance, and poured resin on top. I placed the panel outdoors at night in the countryside, and I ran an electric clamp light out to it and waited for insects to be lured onto the surface and to get stuck there and die. Something of an exercise in cruelty in retrospect. I very soon realized that the cruelty factor was totally unnecessary, and that I was more interested in how the viewer would position themselves in relation to the work, based on the dynamic of attraction and repulsion to seeing oneself and one's surroundings reflected back. So I abandoned the clamp light and the insects. This is a work titled 36 by 36, in parentheses, clear number 2, which dates from 2006. It measures 36 inches square and is made of silver mylar, urethane resin, and mixed media on wood panel. Again, very similar to the first image I showed you, but it's not. A straightforward frontal shot. What you see contained in the image area, again, is my studio, tripod in the middle. I moved in this direction in the mid-90s also partly because I began to feel there were too many pictures in the world. I didn't want to add to this glut of images. And it seemed to me that we'd become unaccustomed to being an active agent in the act of looking. Now even more so, we are constantly bombarded with images. This is the same painting in my studio on the Bowery, same place as the previous one, shot from a different angle. And this is the same painting exhibited in a gallery in Brussels. As a teenager, I'd been very involved in photography, which was, of course, analog back then. This early passion for both shooting and for working in the darkroom has continued to inform my practice. I am interested in that liminal moment when freshly exposed photo paper is immersed in the developer tray and the latent image begins to form, but has not yet coalesced into a recognizable picture. The moment of suspension between the process of becoming visible and the legibility of form. I strive to capture something of that dynamic, to invite the viewer into that fleeting moment. While it has been traditionally assumed that the ideal vantage point for a viewer is to position themselves smack dab in front of the painting in order to apprehend the picture, I'm seeking a different relationship between the viewer and the work. The viewer sees that the picture is in constant flux, determined by their own movement and agency in relationship to the object. One is compelled to view the painting from various angles and stances. The viewer becomes aware that the painting occupies a physical space in the room, and being reflective to some degree, it depicts the site within which it is encountered. This is an installation shot of a work made of silver mylar and resin and tint from an exhibition in Brussels in 2009. And that green speck in the middle, I have to go back. That green speck in the middle is a work that hung opposite it in the gallery. And that blurred form in the lower center area is me and my tripod. Here's another image of that, but it's shot in my studio. I've been casting flexible resin with mylar encapsulated within it as well. This is a piece titled 72 by 18 Blue Fade from 2009. It starts on the wall and bends onto the floor. A two-part cast resin piece spanning a corner and the wall-to-floor connection. This is a cast flexible resin piece that wraps around a corner. And this is another cast resin piece. So I'd say about 10 years ago, I started to drain a lot of the really intense chroma out of my work. I felt that the seduction of color obscured the core concerns of the work. Also, I wanted to restrict the palette so that the latent color, the incipient color, would be more apparent. This is a diptych called Recto Verso from, I believe it's 2012. I've been looking for a material close to the silver mylar, but different, with more body and a vinyl base. I found a vinyl material that was silver on one side and black on the other. I became more fascinated with the black side, what one sees in the black ground as a reflection, and I've worked a lot with it since then. I was also thinking about the idea of the verso, the side one does not see if one is looking at the recto, and teasing out the possibility of having both at the same time. And that brought me back to the silver mylar and the ability to work with its translucent or transparent base that I was revealing through stripping the silver away. The idea that one could see through to the other side in areas intrigued me. The idea that there was paint happening behind the surface rather than on the surface, sort of happening in the area that you couldn't see. And the fact that the silver mylar, this reflective polyester film, could be used as a kind of pre-photographic film, recorded on, taking indexical records of unseen things in my studio. Where I rub, the reflective coating is erased and the transparent plastic base of the mylar film is revealed, and random variations in pressure create differing densities of imprint. This is a detail shot of the previous work. The crackly pattern of rivulets that you can see in the center is the result of the not completely dry black paint behind, interfering with the glue, which is also behind, that I'm using to mount the piece to wood panel. Those kinds of accidents, not accidents, but those kinds of occurrences are things that I look for all the time. The dot pattern derived from bubble wrap brings an array of associations, from honeycomb to dot screens to pixels to cells. And surfing the gamut between randomness and order, the variegated dot pattern formed teases with the viewer's tendency, which is a reflex almost, to find an image. I want the viewer to lurk in that limbo, that place before an image is arrived at. The reflective ground is analogous to the film plane of a camera, a plane upon which the image is never fixed. Light never strikes the painting the same way twice, painting or the object. The same way twice. I'm interested in the antithesis of the decisive moment. The picture arrived at in any given moment is contingent upon the viewer's stance in relationship to the work and their navigation through the space that the painting occupies and reflects. The viewer is implicated as both pictorial subject, present or absent, and as editor. The viewer makes and remakes the picture from the conditions that I've set up. I'm also very interested in negotiations with chance and ways of working blindly. And by that I mean setting up the conditions for something to occur, but not composing or controlling the outcome entirely. In these next two works, that was the kind of process I was using to arrive at the so-called picture. So those ribbons of darker purpley blue that you see are not painted in. I work flat, so they're poured, and the tint tends to collect in certain areas depending on how I set the mylar up with my plastic sheeting underneath, which naturally has creases that forms this kind of surface upon which the paint is kind of taking an impression. This is this way of working blindly this is a mylar that I've put down and rolled black paint all over, and then I let it dry, but not completely. I let it still be slightly wet, and then I roll it up and let it dry more, and then I unroll it and see what I come up with. So part of the black paint lifts off onto the other side of the silver mylar in these random patterns. For the past few years, I've been going through my archive of older works, and I've been reconfiguring and rehabilitating some of them, destroying the works, transforming them into new works. These were unresolved or unfinished works I'd kept for one reason or another. Usually there was something I found compelling, otherwise I would have trashed it. Some of the older works I thought were perfectly acceptable, unfinished, and even good 20 years ago, but looking at them now with fresh eyes, I saw the limitations of the protocol I was adhering to at the time, and it no longer worked. One's protocols are always evolving and changing as one goes, and these next images show this trajectory. This is a work called Crawl Bend that I reconfigured in 2015. It previously hung tacked to the wall like a painting, but with no support, and it wasn't really working for me. When I realized I could allow it to curl from the wall onto the floor, it suddenly clicked. All of that crawling, wet, liquid, frozen in motion suddenly had a relationship to one's sense of gravity. This is a work called Pour/Peel, P-O-U-R, pour. Also from 2015. 2015 was when it was reconfigured. It was a work of silver mylar and urethane resin on wood panel that measured 68 by 32 inches, and it was just unfinished, unresolved, abandoned in the corner of my studio. There was something I liked about it. That's why I kept it around. I ripped it off the panel in 3 sections, and it became a 3-part sculptural work that leans against the wall. You'll notice that the 3 parts overlap in a particular configuration, and that the tearing of the material from the support left what seem like marks, but are actually areas where the silver mylar got left behind, leaving transparent blank areas that you can see through. This is called Peeled Diptych number 2 from 2018. This came out of a test I had done of resin that had a light blue tint mixed with titanium white on a swath of defective brownish mylar I'd been working with extensively. I kept the test as a note, even though I had decided against using this colored tint. I tore the resin from the mylar and set the two pieces side by side. It was a kind of divorce, each side bearing the fragments of residue from its previous entanglement. And the really interesting thing to me about, one of the really interesting things to me about this photo is that it was taken by my friend Bill Jones, and he went to see my show at Commonwealth and Council, and this was hanging there, and he shot this with his phone. But as you can see, he's there on the left half, but his head has disappeared, and his phone is still there, but his hands seem to have disappeared too. This is a work called 18 by 18, and it was a work that was cast within a flat plastic bag. It retained the impression of all the creases in the plastic and the air bubbles that were created in the process. I was thinking about the idea of negative space, the negative space of the interior of the bag. I wanted to turn the negative space into a positive form, which is basically always what one does in casting. My quandary back in 2009 was that I couldn't decide whether it should be on the wall or on the floor, and I felt that it definitely had to be one way or the other. But by 2018, I realized that was no longer true. It could be hung on the wall or set on the floor. It did not have to be either or, it could be either and. Now these next three works I'm going to show you are made of black vinyl mounted to wood panel. I've not gone back and changed them. They've been changing on their own. In each one, I made a fold or a crease in the vinyl. I then unfolded it and mounted it to wood panel before coating it with resin. It was an action that took place and was recorded in a sense, done and then undone. I discovered that over time, the resin lifted off ever so slightly in certain areas, as you can see at the top in the center where you really see that fold happening, and there's a lighter area up there. So it lifted off ever so slightly in certain areas, presumably where the touch of my fingertips had left a residue that acted as a resist, which did not, at first when I poured it, it was perfectly seamless, it was perfectly black. Over time, I discovered, it could have been even a year later, this work, actually it wasn't this work, it was this work, was hanging in a group show at Lucien Terrasse Broome Street space in New York, and one day he texted me and said, "Something's happening to your black painting. It looks like it has changed." And so I asked him to send me a photo, and when I saw it, the photo, I was kind of horrified, and I thought, uh-oh, not archival, unstable, and so on. But then I realized there was something intriguing about it, a picture that can keep developing long after it is considered finished. I thought, wow, I want to work with that. And while the lifting action in this work, for example, has progressed incrementally over the years, I wouldn't characterize it as unstable. It's still, the resin layer is still attached to the vinyl layer, and it's still held together as a work. Crawl Stretch from 2018 is a work that is not changing, but looks as though it could. It's made of urethane resin on black vinyl, no support, tacked to the wall, 85 inches by 48 inches. As you might guess, certain paints and resins do not really want to bind to vinyl or plastic. They crawl and beat up, and then they dry in that beaten up manner. Looking wet liquid on a vertical surface. It seems an impossibility, but there it is. This is a detail of that work. These next two slides are installation shots of Archipelagos 2019 from my exhibition called Panorama at Ulterior Gallery in New York. Back in 2018, in the middle of the Trump years, the migrant crisis at the southern border was erupting, and I felt compelled to go back in the darkroom and add 5 new panels to the original cycle of photographs that I showed you earlier on. adding the names of ICE detention sites and private prisons to that cycle, which I did. And then I had the opportunity to show the analog cycle of the original archipelagos at the Henry in Seattle in 2019. And one of the issues that came up was the fact that these were a set of unique gelatin silver prints, and they would be exposed to light continuously for a long stretch of time, which could damage them or cause them to fade, especially because I requested that they open all the skylights at the Henry, because I was intrigued by the notion that as the light changed, as clouds passed by, it would change the viewer's perception of the work because of the fleeting quality of the light. But it was interesting to me because the prints had sat in my flat files for many years, in the dark, unseen, and now they were being exposed to light, being seen and made vulnerable because of it. Maybe the more I showed them, the more they would begin to disappear. I embraced the fact and felt that could be perhaps in itself an unintended but welcome consequence. I decided to make a digital archival inkjet version of the work, which would become its own independent work, giving it more life, more permanence, more mobility. I'm going to run through, this is an installation shot from the opposite direction at Ulterior. And I'm going to run through the 23 images of Archipelagos 2019, which you're not seeing as you would see them because they're digital files. If you were to see them in real life, they would have holes in the four corners with little teeny pins sticking them into the wall. So over the intervening years, I've taken photographs of the original archipelagos with every new and better digital camera in an attempt to get better documentation of the work. I used these files as the source material for Archipelagos 2019. I was interested in the mechanics of the process of introducing the camera into the mix where it had not been before, taking photographs of photograms, then outputting the prints in a more supposedly archival manner, allowing the tweaks of the technology to add its own incident, and additioning the prints so they would exist as a multiple and could be exhibited more widely and more safely. I was also struck by the fact that some of these places had acquired new layers of association. For example, Guantanamo Bay, located in Cuba, the site of a US naval base. In the early 1990s, it was used to detain Haitian refugees fleeing their country in the wake of the coup d'etat, including a number of HIV-positive Haitians, and it was proposed at the time as a possible quarantine detention facility for US citizens with HIV/AIDS. Going on 20 years now, post 9/11, it's a prison camp for suspects in the forever war on terror. Some of the panels are only letters, not place names. Some are no text at all. That pixelation that you see is actually in the piece. It's not a distortion. This work is titled Outlaw. In 2019, I returned to one of the books I had worked with in the banned book series from the early 1990s, Our Lady of the Flowers by Jean Genet, and I remade the work, which had been a unique gelatin silver print in a horizontal format, as a vertically oriented archival inkjet print, also editioned. This is a shot from my studio of the work that you saw in the very beginning when Terry gave the introduction, configured differently, but it's 24 by 24 Redux is the title, the dates are 2000/2021. So it's a work from 2000, which I've ripped from its original panel in 2 pieces. This was shot in my studio. This was an installation view from the show that's currently up in Reykjavik. But the rules for this are interesting to me because I make the rules, of course. But the configuration there are many possibilities for how the work could be installed. So the installation of the work is variable. The photos are just a few suggestions of different ways it could be installed. And some of the rules are, well, I think these are basically the rules. First of all, the silver side is the only side to face out to the viewer, not the yellow gold side, which is the other side. Secondly, the pieces must always be in relationship to the point where the wall meets the floor. And thirdly, only the straight edges are allowed to rest against the floor or the wall, not the curved edges. The silver side is the previously unseen side, now exposed to view, analogous to peeling a Polaroid with a 20-year interval in between, a kind of play on the notion of exposure. And this is a work that's called Peeled. It originated in 2001, but I ripped it from its base. There was no wood support ever. It was resin and tint on silver mylar. I ripped the resin off the silver mylar, and it took some of the fragments of the silver mylar with it, which you can see. This first photograph was shot in my studio. The second one is an installation view in Reykjavik. And that's a detail shot. And I think that's it. Thank you. Does anyone have questions or comments? I think you raised your hand first.
Hey, Carrie. You have such a beautiful speaking voice. It's really nice to hear you speak. But I wanted to see if you could just list off some of your favorite resins. List off some of your favorite resins.
Oh, my favorite resins? Well, that depends on what it's being used for, because...
Smooth On, Polytech, Numbers.
Oh, I use a lot of Smooth On. Crystal Clear 202 is sort of my standby. Although lately I've started to use some of the newer resins, like Polytech, which I haven't worked with enough to really swear by it, but I've sworn off of, well, actually that's not true. I was gonna say I did work with epoxy resins earlier on. Now I almost only work with urethane resins. I worked with epoxy, but it tends to yellow really badly, so no. And then I also really love, what's it called now? The flexible resin. I'm blanking out on the name of it, but Smooth On makes it for casting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I enjoy your color, your forms, the visualization, the interaction, and it's just captivating. And I was caught saying, have you ever considered putting a nude in one of those formats?
Putting,
Nude?
well, no, because I'm not really interested in, as I mentioned earlier, in pictures.
Okay, sure. Makes sense.
But you could stand up.
Terry.
I'm listening and thinking about just sort of philosophical opportunities and dilemmas of the work, and wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the nature of something being fixed versus what I'm reading as being opportunity, and maybe attitudes toward what an artist can claim, you know, the fixed versus presenting an opportunity. Does that make sense? Something to elaborate on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I certainly in the conceptual, in terms of like the phenomenological, I am totally engaged with this notion that you can never see the same picture twice or make the same picture twice from your encounter. And so in that sense, I feel like they're not fixed, but then I've become more engaged in processes that are not fixed, or even that might even be non-archival, because I also find that since I'm working with unconventional materials, there are some materials I'm not absolutely certain if they're archival, right? And I actually kind of feel like that used to be a problem for me earlier on, but now I think, well, it's plastic. I mean, it's pretty durable. Unfortunately, it's gonna stick around for a long time. So, also the whole notion of archival, I think, is problematic because, I mean, we're living in a world that is not gonna be here forever. And sometimes I think those values of archivalness were founded in an era when people assumed that the world was going to persist, and now it's kind of a question mark, right? Yeah.
How do you know when to stop your creative process?
Like, how do I know when something's finished
Yes.
in a given piece?
Yes.
Well, I spend a long time looking. I mean, I spend a lot of time in the studio just sitting in a chair or walking around looking. So I'm thinking and also re-encountering the work. So I usually don't make a really split decision like, oh, that's it, it's finished. Sometimes I know. I use different criteria. Sometimes something is a dud, and so I know that I have to recode it, recast it, do something to it. And usually it's a dud because it looks too much like a picture of something. But also, I guess I know when something's finished because it's doing something or it's surprising me in a way that's putting me on that certain threshold or edge as a viewer, because of course, like I'm the one making it, but I'm also, in a sense, the viewer, the ideal viewer maybe sometimes. So I know it's finished if it's doing something that is either unsettling or kind of tantalizing or yeah. And that's a completely subjective decision, but which is why sometimes 20 years later, I might make a different decision about it, you know? Yeah,
I have two questions.
yeah.
One, with resin, have you used two different types of resins from two different companies and combined them? You know, because resin is clear if you don't label it. Sometimes you're like, oh, you mix it or so. And then my second question is, what sort of structures or other materials do you feel like marries well with resin, like in stability with it, or like helping you make your
Well, yeah, the thing is, well, for the second question first, I mean, now I'm looking for the instability of the way that the resin might sit on a material, right? You know, and for the first question, sometimes, yeah, in a pinch, I've sometimes used different resins, sometimes even by accident. But then I've also discovered really interesting accidents that arose out of using the wrong resin or mixing the resin in the wrong proportion and getting different results. And so, because I'm always looking for unexpected outcomes, that's okay with me. Yeah.
I really appreciate you being so generous when you're talking about your protocols for how you determine certain things in your work. I wonder, you talked at the beginning about insisting on calling some of these paintings and at other times really hesitating. I wonder what protocols maybe surrounded that, how
Oh, the uneasiness
the
with the.
uneasiness or the language of painting that you attach these to or maybe don't.
That's a big question. It's complicated. I feel like, painting has a very long history that's got a lot of baggage attached to it. And I'm kind of drawn to breaking down some of the edges of like that definition of what painting is. So over time, there have been moments where, especially with painter friends of mine who are really painters, who would say things off the cuff to me like, yeah, but what you do isn't really painting. Because, which seemed to me very parochial because I'm not using a brush, let's say. But it's a definite choice not to use a brush, because I feel like the brush, for me, the brush gets involved with a whole level of connoisseurship and a hierarchy of value about skill and about, and at times a kind of preciousness. And there are many things a lot of baggage associated with the brush, so that's one thing. But so sometimes in reaction to painter friends who say, yeah, but what you do is not really painting, I like to insist that it is. But then sometimes I kind of don't want to be associated with paintings, so I say, well, they're not really paintings. So I'm ambivalent, I guess.
Thank you.
Yes.
Would you say that ambivalence is also the equanimity in the entire work? Because there's always back and forth between what almost happens or becomes because of the process. So that's something in itself, but it keeps transforming. It always keeps transforming.
Mhm.
It's static.
Mm-hmm.
So then that back and forth dialogue about what is it or is it?
That's important because I think those are the questions that I want the viewer to be asking when they're looking at the work. Because I feel like, the viewer, I like putting the viewer on this edge where they're not really sure what they're looking at and they're not really sure if it's a picture or maybe they're making the picture or when does the picture happen. Because I think that that's the moment when they're really looking and really thinking. So that ambivalence is kind of built into, my practice, I guess. Takako, hi.
I have two questions, one responding to what she was asking and what you responded. So regarding your experience and relationship with painting and brush and hierarchy and kind of rejecting that, when you are reading the actual process of painting with this brush and painting something like earlier in your career,
Mm-hmm.
when you are starting to do that, did you consciously have that same notion, like about you reading the process? That's one question.
Oh yeah. I also still, I really have a soft spot for painting, but yes, in the 80s I was painting, and I was painting with a brush and painting with kind of in between figuration and abstraction, and which a lot of painters in New York were doing at that time, still are. And I really have a kind of love of painting, so I'm not anti-painting at all, but I was interested in different. I felt like there was too much of a. It was hard to get surprised by that kind of work, and I wanted to work with different materials than painters' materials. I wanted to work with glass or resin or things that would do other things than what paint does, because I wasn't interested in making pictures, really.
So question number two.
Yeah.
So knowing your work, so many of titles are dimension, like profile and because of this presence of reflection and the experience the audience encounters, that's very environmental, absolutely. And what determines the dimension? Some of those dimensions needs to be a little more simple decision, like 12 by 10 maybe. But 70, I'm really interested in that 72 by, because after seeing, after seeing all these images one by one and just coming across that large painting, you being reflected fully in that scale, I just wonder that specific size, is there any specific relationship between your thoughts and the size?
Oh yeah, well, I always feel that, say, the 12 by 10 size is very intimate, and it's more of it's close to the scale of the head or the face. So it's super intimate, whereas if something's 72 by 45, it encompasses your entire body. So you have a different relationship to it, and it encompasses a lot more space around it. So, but I also title them that way. Well, not all of them are that way. Like sometimes I have things like crawl stretch or crawl bend, but I title them that way because I don't want to give the viewer too much information other than the material features of the work. I don't want to inflect it with too much content.
What is your relationship to the photographs of your work? I just think it's so interesting because I think photography captures non-mutable art maybe a lot better than it captures your art, because my experience of seeing it in a gallery is going to be so different than my experience of seeing it
Totally.
in photography. Does it like cheapen it for you, or what exactly, how do you feel about that?
Well, no, I just feel it doesn't, of course, we have to take photographs of the work, and usually I take the photographs myself. And at times when other galleries have sent other photographers to photograph the work, usually I'm never satisfied with it. So I'm a little bit intrigued by the failure of the photograph to capture the work. But it's difficult too, because for example, now you're sitting here, and if you haven't seen these works in person, then it's hard to know what you're looking at. So it's, but I am fascinated by the failure of photography to represent. And I have a whole idea for a whole new project that's kind of about that, in a way, that's photographic. Yeah.
Maybe my question could be a little bit related to what she said. So when we look at your work, we cannot see anything without light, or perhaps we could see with tiny lights. I don't know. I have a question. What is that light for your idea for your work?
You mean ideal light?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
or what is the light for your work?
So I'm super interested in light, clearly. But I wouldn't say, for example, that natural light is the best light or artificial light is the best light, because I like the fact that works appear differently in every single different circumstance. I like, at the Henry, I really wanted to have the natural light because I knew that it was like a big exhibition space and clouds would go by, and sometimes someone could come on a cloudy day, it would be a certain quality of light, but then another viewer could come on a really sunny day and it would be a different kind of light. So I was fascinated by the different variations and possibilities for light. Yeah.
You've also had used phosphorescent.
Oh, yeah.
So, and you've also shown work in the dark.
That's true. I have shown work in the dark because I was using phosphorescent pigments, powder pigments, which I didn't show you any images of. And the interesting thing to me wasn't that, well, in the daylight, let's say, it would look kind of like a jade green color. And at night, it would be a kind of turquoise, bright turquoise as soon as you turn the lights off. But it was more the in-between that really fascinated me. So as in natural light in that case, as the sun would go down, the color would shift ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly. And that's why I loved that, using that kind of pigment. Yeah.
I was also thinking of Paul's that feel of
Yeah.
it's dark on the video.
That's true. I've shown. That's true. Yeah, it was a darkened room, and the only ambient light was the light of your video piece that was illuminating it, and that was super exciting because you have a different experience in the dark when you view things.
And also you're very, it's not that usual to get to see a piece in less light, but also get to be with it and then see how it falls.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's also almost better in shadow, not so much better reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Just the nature of your work to be so subject to this environment is fascinating, and we're about out of time. I just have this big question I'm not going to ask about it, but I guess the idea, I mean, clearly you not only are fine with, you set up the opportunity for things to be reflected, and I just keep thinking, what is the relationship between not making pictures and reflection?
Mm-hmm.
Because a picture happens, but you didn't make that picture, you created the opportunity for that picture.
Right. The viewer makes the picture.
Right. Okay, that's it.
The viewer makes the picture and makes very different pictures all the time, depending on the situation in which it's viewed.
And I can imagine that sometimes things get reflected into your work that might offend you.
Yeah. That's the difficult thing with group shows sometimes, honestly. Or lightings in different exhibition spaces. Like sometimes the light is, glaring and a big old clamp light or something shining, Yeah. Any last questions before we go?
Thank you so much, Carrie. You've been so
Oh,
generous.
thank you.